Hi, my name is Connor Riley, and on this week's Connor in Coverage, we're going to talk about the difference between winning and losing and living in the playoff. Our first winner this week is the Georgia Special Teams units. While Georgia capped a perfect regular season with their 37-14 win over Georgia Tech on Saturday, it was far from a perfect effort overall from the Bulldogs. Their offense struggled at times in the first half, while the defense gave up their first quarter touchdown of the season. But if there is a positive or a perfect angle from this Saturday's game, it would be the play of the Georgia special teams, and not just in one particular area. Jack Podlesny made all three of his field goal attempts, including a season-long 50-yarder. Brett Thorson had a 51-yard punt that was fair caught, and then had another punt down at the 1-yard line after a spectacular play by Ladd McConkey. McConkey also got involved in punt return as he had a season-long 39-yard return for the Bulldogs in that aspect of the game. And to make things worse for Georgia Tech on Saturday, special teams was the one area where they really let themselves down, where their punter, David Shanahan, dropped the punt at one point and was tackled by Tresman Marshall and Shmael Munden. I'm a mess right now. After doing so, Georgia took advantage of the 17-yard field and scored on a Brock Bowers touchdown pass to really put the game away on Saturday afternoon. Georgia was far from perfect on Saturday, as we discussed at the top of the show, but it was a real reminder of the importance of special teams because those are the plays that can win you big games. Georgia's going to need to be better in other aspects of the field this coming week against LSU and potentially in the college football playoff in the games to come. But for Georgia to be this good on special teams should be a very encouraging sign as the games get bigger and better. And we know that this Georgia offense and defense are capable of putting on better performances than what we saw this past Saturday. Our first loser, well, that's the 2022 SEC Championship game. This game was set to have a lot of drama with theoretically both teams playing for possible playoff positioning going into this week. Georgia obviously trying to maintain the number one overall ranking, while LSU still, in theory, had a chance of making the playoff. But that theory went out the window following their stunning loss to Texas A&M on the road. They lost 38-21. It was the first time all season Texas A&M had scored more than 30 points against a Power 5 opponent. Obviously, this is the first time since 2016 that a three-loss team will be playing in the SEC championship game. But if you think that's going to limit any attention away from Georgia or the fact that the Bulldogs seem to have already locked up their college football playoff berth, you'd be very mistaken. This team knows what happened in the SEC championship game last year when they lost 41-23 to Alabama. And they know they have a chance on Saturday to separate themselves from that team by winning the SEC, something the Bulldogs haven't done since 2017. And while national championships are the ultimate goal, Georgia winning the SEC is still a very big accomplishment for Kirby Smart.
No, we're worried about winning an SEC championship. That's the most important thing on our agenda is to have an opportunity to do something that rarely gets done. I mean, it's tough to win an SEC championship. I've been part of this league for a long time, and I have almost as many national championships as I do SEC championships, and they're really hard to come by. So we're focused on LSU.
I think after that performance on Saturday, Georgia knows that it's going to need to be better against LSU on this coming Saturday. Look back to only the Kentucky game where Kentucky was coming off a loss against Vanderbilt, but was able to keep that a 10-point final margin against the Bulldogs this previous week. The last time that three-loss team played in the SEC championship came back in 2016. That was when the Florida Gators were playing the number one ranked Alabama Crimson Tide. The number one team in the country that day came away with the 54-16 victory in a game that was rather anticlimactic. I think Georgia is hoping to follow the exact same recipe this coming Saturday as they look to win their first SEC title since 2017. Our next winner, well, that's Stetson Bennett. He'd be the first to tell you, as he did in his post-game press conference, that Saturday was far from his finest performance. He only had 140 total passing yards, and a majority of those came on an 83-yard dime he had to Kenny McIntosh in the fourth quarter. He completed only 10 of his 18 passes and had 2 touchdowns, but it was far from a perfect send-off for the quarterback. He admitted after the game that that his mind wasn't exactly right going into the game, as instead of focusing on Georgia Tech, he held a white special commemorative football in his hands while he was honored on the field beforehand with his family. Bennett has obviously done a lot in his time at Georgia, and it's time to put some of that in perspective as his career draws closer to an end. While he's not the sole reason why Georgia has been as good as it has been in recent years, it's worth considering where this program was before he arrived here as a walk-on in 2016, when they went 8-5. Since coming on scholarship in 2019, Bennett and the Bulldogs have gone 46-5 overall. And with Bennett as a starter, Georgia is 26-3, with the last loss coming against Alabama in last season's SEC championship game. Bennett means a lot to this Georgia football program beyond just the statistical measures or what a quarterback is supposed to do in terms of downfield passing and managing a game. If you don't believe me in saying that, listen to what Kirby Smart had to say about the Georgia signal caller.
Incredible impact. He's a leader. He's tough, a competitor. He's just been around, it seems like forever now, and he embodies our team with this competitive toughness. And he's got to keep doing the things he's doing for us to be successful, and we know we got to play better on really all three phases, better than we did today if we want to get where we want to go.
Bennett won both of his senior games, winning last year against Charleston Southern and then beating Georgia Tech on Saturday. He's got a chance to add more accolades to his haul as he can win an SEC championship this coming Saturday and possibly win his second national championship, provided that Georgia keeps on winning. There are plenty of more talented quarterbacks out there and quarterbacks that are going to be first overall picks. Sure, CJ Stroud might have better numbers than him this year, but after watching what happened to Ohio State on Saturday, I'm not sure how you can look at what Georgia has with Stetson Bennett and what CJ Stroud has been for Ohio State and the flaws that he has in his game and say, you know what, give me CJ Stroud to lead my football team. Yeah, Bennett might not have the best arm or be the fastest or biggest player out there, but he brings something intangible to this team that makes them better. And it's time we all recognize that as he enters into the final, what could be 3 games of his Georgia career and cap off what has truly been a sensational time here in Athens. Our next loser, well, that's playoff drama. 4 top 10 teams losing this past weekend goes a long way to sapping out some of the mystery surrounding who might be the 4 college football playoff teams. Michigan, TCU, and Georgia all enter this week with unbeaten records and seem like they'll be locks to make the college football playoff, even potentially with a loss. The only real intrigue happens on Friday night when USC plays Utah in a game where Utah won earlier this season, but that was played at Utah and was a 43-42 shootout. If USC and Caleb Williams are able to pick up another ranked win, it'll likely lock them into the college football playoff, doing so in an impressive manner after beating UCLA last week and Notre Dame this past Saturday. Now, if USC loses, it makes things all the more interesting as a real debate sets up between Ohio State, who lost to Michigan this weekend in blowout fashion, or an Alabama team that has lost twice to LSU and Tennessee. Hopefully USC wins on Friday, so we're not subjected to that sort of debate over the course of the weekend. But it is worth reminding as we consider the 12-team possible playoff expansion that is coming in recent seasons, where the playoff things sort of stand. You'll hear people this week say, this is why we should have a 4-team playoff because there aren't 4 teams good enough. On the other hand, if they were in a 12-team model, teams like LSU, Clemson, Utah, Kansas State, Tulane, and UCF would all be possibly playing not only for a chance to get into the college football playoff, but jockeying for possible home games in that first round. Whether or not this is a 12 or a 14 playoff and what's better for college football, frankly, I don't care about. I think we've seen time and time again that it's the games themselves and the matchups and the rivalries that make college football special. I think it's a big reason why this week's SEC championship game doesn't feel quite as big because it's not Alabama that Georgia is seeing, but an LSU team that just doesn't have the same history and connective tissue to this Georgia program. Ultimately, Georgia's going to be in the college football playoff. I believe that regardless of what happens on Saturday, they are in either way. And LSU is very clearly out after their loss to Texas A&M this past week. But in terms of figuring out and spending those early Sunday morning hours deciding who might be that 4th team in the college football playoff, well, we're probably not going to have that because there's a very good chance by the time we wake up on Saturday morning, we'll already know who the 4 college football playoff teams will be. And the only thing to be decided on Saturday will be the slots and jockeying of who goes where. Because if Georgia wins on Saturday against LSU, they're very likely to lock up the number 1 seed and thus play their college football semifinal game in Atlanta in the Peach Bowl. Our final winner, well, it's the Georgia defensive standard. Georgia's going to play better offenses in games to come, especially with Caleb Williams looking like a real threat for USC and an LSU offense that scored 30 points against Alabama earlier this season. But with the regular season in the books, it's time to consider what this Georgia defense has done in context of the regular season. The Bulldogs once again ranked number 1 in scoring defense, doing so in back-to-back seasons and for a 3rd time in 4 years. There's also the fact that Georgia ranks in the top 5 in rushing yards allowed, 1st in the country, yards per play allowed, 4th in the country, and yards per passing attempt, 5th in the country. By almost any metric, this is an elite defense, which makes the fact that this group lost 5 first-round draft picks from last year, 8 total starters, and a Butkus Award winner in Nakobe Dean all the more impressive for what this defense is able to do. They've gotten elite play from each level of the field, with whether it be Jalen Carter on the defensive line, the tandem of Shmuel Munden and Jamon Dumas-Johnson, and then the excellent safety play of Chris Smith and Malachi Starks. If there is one concern at this point in time, it is probably the outside linebacker position, as Nolan Smith is out for the rest of the season, and Marvin Jones Jr. is now dealing with an ankle injury. That puts an awful lot on the plate of Robert Beal and Chaz Chambliss, who, quite frankly, just aren't as good players as Nolan Smith is. That's no insult to either Chambliss or Beal, but just speaks to how talented and how much Nolan Smith did for this Georgia team. Georgia's had to replace a lot of key faces over the recent seasons. Consider that in 2019, Georgia also had the number one scoring defense in the country. And yet by the end of the year, it never seems to matter who the faces are or who has to be replaced from the previous season. Because the Georgia defensive standard is that if you're on the field and you're good enough, you're old enough to be a member of it. And if you're on the field, you're a defensive starter. This defense has gotten better over the course of the season and is peaking at the right time. Even after giving up its first quarter touchdown of the season, Georgia didn't give up a touchdown until its final possession on Saturday, when Georgia Tech needed a fourth down trick play to get into the end zone for a second time. Georgia defense continues to get better, and as the schedule will get tougher these next couple of weeks, I think you can also feel reasonably comfortable about this Georgia defense rising to the challenge, given they've done that all season long.
We had good leadership last year, and we've got good leadership this year. And if you have good leadership, then you've got an opportunity to grow and get better. And this group was not where it needed to be in the spring, and we had some long days in spring practice, but they filled in the holes nicely that we needed, and they've improved throughout the year. And they need to be at their best now when their best is needed. And we need to get better this week to be the team we need to be defensively.
So that does it for our winners and losers segment. As we move into a very big SEC championship game, we'll open it up to questions here maybe a little bit earlier than we usually do. Thoughts, comments on this game against LSU, the win over Georgia Tech. If anyone wants to really talk about and discuss that, we can certainly do so there. Quick injury updates. We'll knock this out of the way at the top. A.D. Mitchell did play on Saturday. It was his first game action since the Auburn game back on October 8th. He only played one snap, but when asked on Sunday evening, Kirby Smart did say that Mitchell is continuing to make progress, and I think there's a real chance this coming Saturday against LSU, we might see him on a workload of, say, 10 to 12 snaps, similar to what we saw George Pickens do last season in this game for Georgia. Marvin Jones Jr., as we touched on earlier tonight, is dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury there, and it sounds like he may not be able to play this week, depending on how severe it is, which Kirby Smart will let us know more when we ask about it either on Monday or Thursday. Zion Logue left yesterday's game with an undisclosed injury. Apparently, it had been an injury he first suffered in the game against Kentucky, but Kirby Smart told reporters this night, that Logue is expected to be fine and be able to go out there and play in the game. On the LSU side, Jaden Daniels picked up an ankle injury last night and was in a boot on Saturday, as Brian Kelly told reporters on Sunday night. And the hope, though, there is that for Daniels, he's able to get out there and practice on the field on this coming Tuesday, when LSU takes the field. I think one thing to keep in mind here with Daniels as he does deal with this ankle injury, and you heard Kirby Smart talk about this if you heard his post-game press conference on our YouTube page, is the speed and quickness that Daniels plays with. He had 95 rushing yards against Alabama earlier this season. And I do think that his ability to get sideline to sideline will make things very difficult for this Georgia team. But if he's injured and not able to go full strength and get as fast as he can be, getting away from Georgia defenders like a Jalen Carter or like a Shmuel Munden, I think that's really going to jeopardize this LSU offense. And I think we saw that a little bit last night against Texas A&M. While the defense was maybe a bigger problem than what we saw for LSU going into this game against Georgia, if Jaden Daniels isn't 100% and isn't able to use his legs effectively, I think this Georgia defense is going to feast on LSU and make things very, very difficult for the Tigers. And so with that, we will open it up to your questions, comments, thoughts. Yeah, I see some people complaining about the referees from yesterday. It was a questionable day, to say the least. I will note that was an SEC crew. So if you want to, say ACC was trying to keep Georgia in it, or keep Georgia Tech in it, you can't go that far because it was an SEC crew officiating the game. But yeah, just a puzzling day from the officials there, to say the least. Let's see. Yeah, Easy Brown. This is a good question. LSU's pass rush is one of the better ones Georgia will have seen this season. Obviously, B.J. Ojulari is a name a lot of Georgia fans know from both his recruitment out of Marietta High School and the fact that his older brother Aziz played at Georgia and played quite well for the Bulldogs here. Ali Gay is another big-time pass rusher that LSU has. And then obviously Harold Perkins might be the best freshman in the country and is right there with Malachi Starks in terms of the impact that he has had this season. Georgia is going to have to know where he is on the field at all points in time. And it's going to be a big week for these offensive tackles, Broderick Jones and Warren McClendon. I'm going to have a story on Broderick later on in the week and sort of his growth and development here at Georgia. But those guys are going to need to stand tall. And I think one way that we've seen Georgia, and they'll do this to try and counteract, LSU playing fast and trying to be aggressive with Ojulari, Gay, and Harold Perkins. Look for a lot of quick passes to Brock Bowers. We saw that on Saturday, 5 receptions, but only 20 yards. But I still think that is something that Georgia has done consistently enough over the course of the season to where that is a staple of this offense and a way to counteract the opposing pass rush. I also think you're going to see a big game from Kenny McIntosh in terms of pass catching, given that there's going to be a month off between this game and Georgia's possible college football playoff game. I think Georgia's going to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how they use him in the pass game like they did earlier on in the season, and they'll be less worried about managing his workload given some of the bumps and bruises that he has had over the course of the season. So while, yes, LSU's pass rush is something to monitor and be worried about, I think Georgia has enough weapons on the outside in terms of counteracting in the quick game a way to attack that. Let's see. Barry Watkins. I think, what we see on Saturday or on this Tuesday, rather, when the College Football Playoff Committee releases their rankings, it's going to be really interesting because Ohio State got thoroughly outplayed on Saturday at home, whereas Alabama's 2 losses, rather, both on the road, both one-score games. Now, I think if you take a step back and look at the totality of the resumes, I think Ohio State clearly has the better resume. They have a win over Penn State, which I believe was on the road there. They do not have a game decided by single digits this season, whereas Alabama has played in 5 of them. And so, the totality of the resume, I think, favors Ohio State a little bit, along with the fact that Alabama's best win is either over an 8-4 Texas or an 8-4 Mississippi State. And Ohio State, I do think, has the better resume, but with how Ohio State looked on Saturday, where they were just clearly outmatched by Michigan, and then B, look, this committee, I believe, has shown in the past that there is a bias towards Alabama, and they are willing to give Alabama the benefit of the doubt when it comes to these sorts of things. And Bryce Young is still a fantastic player. Will Anderson is a game wrecker. And it's an Alabama team that this committee has shown in the past is willing to give the belief that this is an elite team based on the logo on the side of their helmet. I don't believe that Alabama has looked like a top 4 team this season. And if USC takes care of business on Friday night, we will not have to deal with that. But it's not a foregone conclusion that USC wins on Saturday. I think this is a Utah team that is more than capable of beating USC. We saw them do it earlier in the year. And I do think that, if you're USC, it's really hard to play really good teams 3 weeks in a row and play an A game in each of those. UCLA, Notre Dame, and then Utah, 3 straight games. That is a tough stretch against foes that are capable of beating you and capable of putting on a good performance. So I think this debate over Ohio State or Alabama at 5 is going to be very interesting. I think it ultimately is going to matter because I'm not confident that USC beats Utah on Friday. And I think there's a good chance we wake up on Saturday morning and Sunday morning as well and saying, all right, do you take a flawed Ohio State team or a 2-loss Alabama team there? And I think one of those teams is going to end up playing Georgia in the college football playoff. I know Alabama fans would love to find a way to squeak in there, whereas Ohio State, we'll see how the fan base is feeling after really just another beatdown at the hands of the rival Michigan this week. If you're Georgia, though, I think with what you've seen from both those teams this season, you shouldn't be afraid or worried about either one of them. I think you should be confident that Georgia is capable of beating one or the other. Obviously, there is the connective history with Alabama, and especially if that game is played in Atlanta in that stadium, Georgia still has, I think, some things to prove against Alabama in terms of the long haul and long-term program development. But within the confines of the 2020 season, or 2022 season, rather, I think Georgia should feel very comfortable about either Ohio State or Alabama if either one of them is at number 4. And I would include USC in there as well, but I think USC is going to get tripped up this weekend. Let's see. Comments, thoughts. So Cale Stone, so Brandon Adams and I actually discussed this at halftime on Saturday, and I think we can say that Georgia at times this year definitely played down to its competition. It did so, I think, on Saturday against Georgia Tech. It did so against Kentucky. It did so against Missouri. It did so against Kent State. But the flip side of that is that Georgia has played up to the level of competition in games against Oregon, in games against the South Carolina team that is 8-4 and has big wins over Clemson and Tennessee now, in a game against Tennessee. When they have needed to be their best this season, they have been that and more. And as you enter a stretch where it's an SEC championship game, it is a college football playoff game, and then obviously potentially a national title game, I think this Georgia team is going to be more than up for the challenge in those games. And, we'll see how this LSU game plays out. If they, don't give their best and win, 31-17 or something like that, and they don't dominate LSU in the manner I think they probably should go out and dominate LSU, given what we saw Tennessee do to them, given what we saw Texas A&M do to them. I think maybe then you worry about whether this team can, in fact, win a national championship. But right now, I still put more stock in what I have seen in the games against Oregon, Tennessee, and South Carolina. I think the best teams that Georgia has played on their schedule, along with, Florida as well, maybe on the road at Mississippi State, rather than the Kentuckys, the Missouris, the Georgia Techs of the world, because I think those former set of teams are closer to what Georgia is going to see in the SEC championship and the college football playoff than what Georgia saw on Saturday. Let's see. Johnny Bolton. I agree with this here. If you can avoid playing Bryce Young, I think you should. And again, I think Georgia will beat Alabama if they do meet up on the field this year. But there's not a quarterback in the country I would take over Bryce Young and what he is able to do. And if it is a close game late, I know Georgia won last year with Ringo having the iconic pick six, but I think Bryce Young has shown more times than not that he is certainly capable of leading Alabama to a win there. And it was only this time a season ago when Young absolutely shredded an all-time Georgia defense in the SEC championship game. Now, obviously, this Alabama team is very, very different than the one I think we saw a season ago, but this is an Alabama team there. Let's remove Georgia from the equation. If you're giving me, who do you think could win the national championship other than Georgia, I'd probably take Alabama over every other team out there, including a Michigan team that looked very good on Saturday against Ohio State. And Joseph Kennedy, this is a fair point. The committee has not taken a 2-loss team yet. And, we'll see if they have the stomach to do so, especially over a 1-loss Ohio State team, that their only loss is to a team in the college football playoff. Whereas Alabama, both their losses are to teams that are not going to be in the college football playoff. Easy Brown. We touched on this earlier. Significant reps. I wouldn't say that. I would say maybe if you can get 10 snaps, 12 snaps, I think that's sort of what we're looking for from Mitchell there. It sounds like he's making more progress in practice right now. As far as, a game changer, I don't know if I can say that. He might be a guy who, if you can get 1 or 2 catches out of him, I think that would be great. But anything really more than that, I think at this point is an unrealistic expectation for Mitchell. This has just happened to be a lost season for him in terms of the ankle injury, the way it was suffered, and the way it never really gave him a chance to heal. But he'll be back next season, and I think if he returns to full strength, we will see a very, very talented wide receiver on Georgia's team next year. Whereas I think if he goes through this year fully healthy, I think A, he puts up very big numbers, and B, I do believe that he could have gone pro after this season. And if he puts up the numbers that I think he would have, I think he would be definitely something he would consider. Let's see. Comments, thoughts, questions. Answered a little bit on A.D. Mitchell there. Scotty G, yeah, I do think TCU is playoff worthy. They've won each one of their games. I was dead wrong on them this weekend. I thought this was maybe a letdown spot for them, and they just absolutely blew out a quality Iowa State defense, scoring, I believe, 62 points in their win. How they stack up on the field, most likely against Michigan in that 2-3 matchup, we'll see. Michigan will likely be favored in that game, but for me, if you win all your games and are still dealing with the questions of whether or not you're worthy of being in the playoff, you clearly have something wrong with your playoff, because TCU has done everything that they've been asked to do. They are very likely going to win, I think, what is a very good league in the Big 12, maybe the second or third best league conference-wide in college football this year. I think I'd probably put them second behind the SEC, and it's honestly not that far from the SEC and the Big 12 this year, as I do think the SEC as a whole is a little bit down compared to where it has been in years past. And TCU beat everyone in that league, and they, I believe, were the second team since they went to the full round robin in 2011 to go 9-0 in the regular season slate. That's something Lincoln Riley did not do when he was the head coach at Oklahoma there. So I think that speaks to what TCU has done this season. In my opinion, they're absolutely worthy of being in a college football playoff, even if they do not have the sort of raw recruiting talent that a Georgia, USC, even a Michigan have at this point in time. Let's see. Percy Johnson. So this is and we'll touch a little bit because I do think there's a good chance that Georgia USC is the 1 versus 4 college football playoff matchup. I think that'll be it. If, Georgia, Michigan, TCU, and USC all win this weekend. USC is the number 1 turnover margin in the country. They are a very poor defense, but they excel at forcing turnovers. And we have seen at times this season, this is a Georgia offense where they will give you the ball 2 or 3 times, or not 3 times, but 1 or 2 times over the course of a game. If, over the flow of the game where they've been a little bit sloppy. You saw it against Florida. You saw it against Mississippi State there. And so I do think that this is a Georgia team where if you do want to nitpick a little bit here, I do think turnovers, especially on the offensive side of the ball, have been an issue. And that is something where USC has been very good at. It is not always a replicable model of success. There's a big reason why Georgia looks more at explosive plays and the ability to get them on offense and prevent them on defense as a more indicative measure of success rather than turnovers, because I think explosive plays are something that you can replicate on a year in, year out basis, whereas turnovers are very luck induced there, and that is not a replicable model for success. Let's see. Thoughts, comments. We'll maybe do a few more here before heading out. Jeff, no, I don't. I don't think that Michigan is going to be number 1 in the committee, at least going into this week. Michigan's non-conference schedule is an absolute joke, and we saw this committee sort of punish them for that at the beginning of these rankings, ranking them behind Clemson when both teams were undefeated there. And well, yes, Michigan probably does now have the quote-unquote more impressive win with their win over Ohio State. I think when you look at the totality of resumes here, Georgia's is still superior. If you go top wins, Michigan's are probably, you've got Ohio State, obviously, Penn State as well. The Penn State game was at home. You then have, probably Purdue this weekend, who might not even be ranked when they play them in the Big Ten championship game there in Indianapolis. And then you're looking at a win over Illinois as your 4th best win. Whereas Georgia, you've got Oregon, you've got Tennessee, you've got South Carolina, and you've got Mississippi State, along with Florida, who ultimately pooped the bed this past weekend against Florida State. But I think when you look at the totality of the resume there for Georgia, I think that carries the flag. And a win over LSU is going to be more impressive than a win over Purdue. And I think that is going to keep Georgia at the number 1 spot in the college football playoff rankings. So if the Bulldogs win on Saturday, which I think everyone here expects them to do so, they're a multiple touchdown favorite. I do think that Georgia will be the number 1 seed, and they will get to play in Atlanta for the college football playoff semifinal. Let's see. Yeah, and Jeremy, this is a good point on Michigan. They needed a 4th down conversion and a late field goal to beat Illinois a week ago. And while Georgia, yes, the Missouri game was imperfect. That was a long time ago, and that is the only 1-score game on their resume. Let's see. No, I don't think there's a chance USC leapfrogs TCU just because TCU will have gone unbeaten against their conference, and I do think that they value that more, even though USC did win the Pac-12 and in this theoretical scenario, and we'll have a win over Notre Dame there as well. I think the fact that TCU went undefeated against their conference strength rather than what USC did, I think that makes the ultimate difference here for TCU. And that's why you will see them as the number 3 team, assuming they win. Now, if they lose, I think there's a real chance where TCU becomes the number 4 team and they keep them in over Ohio State, but we'll ultimately see how that gets decided. And this is a TCU team, I think, granted, I said Iowa State was going to keep it close this past week, and they very much did not. It's a Kansas State team that they were up big on TCU early in that game, and TCU was able to rally late and win that game. But Kansas State is a team that can hang with TCU, and I think could possibly beat them this weekend in the Big 10 championship game, or Big 12 championship game, rather. Kale Stone, no, I do not. We're getting relatively close here to the early signing period, and Georgia, they pick up commitment from Anthony Evans this past weekend. This time a week from now, we'll know the decision made by five-star edge rusher Samuel Mpemba. I don't think Georgia's going to be able to catch Alabama for the number one ranked recruiting class in the 2023 cycle, both with where Alabama sits with a few key targets and where Georgia is. Georgia's just going to have to settle with the number two ranked recruiting class, but I think this Georgia coaching staff under Kirby Smart has earned the trust of, okay, yeah, you might not have the number one ranked recruiting class and you might not have all these five stars, but with the way this staff has been able to evaluate and make decisions and win recruiting battles on key guys that are not only good players, but more importantly, fit the Georgia program, I think indicate that, Alabama and Ohio State have been the number 1 and 2 recruiting programs in recent years. 2021, they were number 1 and number 2 while Georgia came in at number 4. But you look at that 2021 Georgia recruiting class, Brock Bowers was not a top 100 player. Jamon Dumas-Johnson was not a top 100 player. Shmuel Munden was a fringe 5-star prospect there. But that Georgia class was not nearly, in terms of the recruiting rankings, as elite as the Alabama class. But what we have seen in terms of the contributions from those players already at Georgia, I think you feel very comfortable about some of the guys you have in that class. Kamari Lassiter is another name there. Amarius Mims is a guy that has played key reps for Georgia already. Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins looks like a guy who's going to be a real player on this defensive line for Georgia there. A.D. Mitchell is another big name to know. Obviously, though, we haven't seen as much from him this season as we have in years past. And so having said all that, I think, well, yes, Georgia may not finish with the number 1 recruiting ranking. They're still going to sign a top 3 class in terms of raw talent. With what we have seen year in and year out now in terms of the type of character guys that Georgia is going out and getting, you should feel very, very good about what Georgia is about to bring in once again in the 2023 recruiting class. So that'll be it here for me this week. This time next week when I see you guys once again, we will know the Final Four for the college football playoff. I expect regardless of what happens this weekend, Georgia will be one of those 4 teams in there. I think Georgia is still going to win this weekend and beat LSU and win their first SEC championship since the 2017 season. It's a busy week here for Dog Nation. We've got our event at Marlowe's in Brookhaven on Wednesday. Make sure to come out to that. You've got Dog Nation Daily with Brandon Adams every Monday through Friday, On the Beat with Mike Griffith tomorrow night, Before the Hedges with Justin Tell on Wednesday. And then the SEC championship game on Saturday, college football playoff reveal on Sunday. We're going to have plenty of stuff for you guys coming out of both of those events there. Obviously, Georgia looking to get back into the playoff for a second year in a row and go for 2 and winning a second straight national championship there. So thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight. My name has been Connor Riley. Next time I see you guys here in Connor and Coverage, we will be talking about who Georgia will be playing in the first round of the college football playoff. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We will see you next Sunday night.